Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show this Sunday. Really glad to have you guys here. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of speculation into what's happening in the repo market. And, I have to do speculation because the Fed's not telling us anything. They're not telling us what banks are receiving this money, and they're not going to tell us. So if they're not going to tell us, I have to speculate. And I'm going to try to explain it to you in my own terms because it's complicated, and try to understand it but this is pure speculation. Here's what I think's going on. Going back, well, first let's start the charts right here and take a look. We're going to take a look at the U.S. Treasury market. And what I want you to look at is this peak right here, going back into 2018, around the latter part of 2018. And you guys remember I was on here and I was talking about this, and I said I was talking about 3.25%. We did go up and touch 3.25% on the U.S. 10-year. And I was saying to you guys, I think it's going to go higher, I was saying, right? And I think it's going to bust the stock market, Well, it turns out I was wrong. It went lower. And then when it started to go lower, I was on here telling you guys, who's buying these? I was like, who? See the yields falling? When the yields are falling, there's buyers in there buying the U.S. 10-year. I was like, who? Who's buying this? And I was like searching for who's buying it. Well, I thought it might be inflows of capital coming in from other countries buying them, or because they had a little bit of a higher yield than they would get anywhere else, up around 3.25%. And I was speculating as to who's buying them. I didn't know who was buying them. Well, you guys thought it might be the Fed that's buying them. Now, a lot of you guys come in and commented on my channel and said, oh, the Fed's buying these treasury bonds. I didn't quite buy that explanation, because the Fed wasn't in quantitative easing, and we didn't see a rise in their balance book at that particular time. So I didn't really quite buy that explanation, but I knew there was a buyer, and they bought these things all the way down from all the way down to like 1.5% or whatever. They bought enormous amounts of treasuries. I didn't know who the buyer was. Well, looks like, in my speculation here, that the buyers were the big United States banks. And they were using their liquidity or their cash flow to buy these treasuries. And the reason why they were buying these treasuries is, heck, it looked like a pretty good deal. It was up near 3.25% on the U.S. 10-year. And they figured to themselves, I guess, that the Fed is going to go back to quantitative easing. And the Fed's going to buy all these treasuries off of us for a great profit. We're going to make a great profit, So they were buying hand over fist, expecting the Fed to go back to quantitative easing. Basically, they were front-running the Fed, going back to quantitative easing. But what they did was, I guess, buying all these treasuries and using their cash reserves, they lowered their cash reserves right down to almost nil over this period when they were buying, and we see the yields dropping all the way down to the bottom. They were lowering their cash reserves, and their cash reserves were getting less and less. I guess their cash reserves got to a certain point, these big banks, these big too big to fail banks, where I guess it's kind of like, if you were making a wage, from your job, and you got paid once a month, so they paid you a big lump of money, your pay for the whole month. And you went out and bought all silver with it. Well, toward the end of that month, then, you'd start to run short on cash because you got all your cash in silver. Well, I guess that's what's happened to the banks. They've got all of their money in treasuries. 10-year, 30-year, whatever. They've been buying these treasuries like crazy, and they've made themselves cash short. So then what happened was, because they were cash short, Well, they said what little bit of cash we got left over, we want to hang on to it. We don't want to lend it to the speculators in the repo market, the hedge funds. We don't want to lend this money to the hedge funds in the repo market at a low rate because we're low on cash. We're going to charge a higher rate. So that's what they said. They said, okay, we're cutting off the lending unless we get the money we want, unless we get the rate we want in the repo market, And it was like 10% overnight, and that's what they wanted because they're so low on cash. So then I guess what happened was the Fed stepped in, and the Fed became the lender into the repo market, because the banks shut off lending to the repo, or didn't shut it off entirely, but what they did was they said, well, we only got a little bit of cash left because we bought all these treasuries, hoping that the Fed is going to go back to quantitative easing and buy all these treasuries off of us. Meanwhile, I guess what's happened is the Fed has went back to quantitative easing, sort of, not really quantitative easing. Now they're buying treasury bills, T-bills, right? Which have a short-term maturity. They're not buying these long-term bonds, that have like 10-year, these 10-year bonds and stuff that the banks loaded up on. So I guess the way it's happening now is that the banks are going to continue to be stingy about lending to the hedge funds in the repo market until they get these bonds sold. And the only buyer out there, I guess, is the Fed. And the Fed has to go back to quantitative easing in order to real quantitative easing, where they buy up these long-term maturities, these long-term bonds off of the banks. And then the banks once the Fed does that, then the banks will have their ample liquidity to go back to lending to the repo market again. I guess this is some sort of a complex circle of money. It's hard to understand it, but this is the way I'm trying to understand it myself, guys. It's so complicated, but I guess this is what's happening in the repo market is that these big banks, big to fail institutions are cash poor right now. And the only way they're going to get out of this cash poor situation is if the Fed comes in and does real quantitative easing. And so the Fed, they're doing this, buying all these T-bills, and they're supporting the repo market. So the Fed's sitting back, I guess, and saying, well, we don't have to go back to quantitative easing just yet, real quantitative easing. We can just continue to buy these T-bills and continue to support the repo market. And you banks out there, I guess you got it all wrong buying all those treasuries because we're not going to buy them, So, weird situation going on. Now, what could happen next? Well, these banks out there that's holding all these treasuries, waiting for the Fed to buy them, and the Fed says they're not going to buy them, they might dump them onto the market to increase their liquidity. Well, if that happens, then we could see a spike in the yields of these U.S. treasuries very easily, and in turn, that could also affect equities, and not in a positive way. So I guess the pressure would be on the Fed now to go back to real quantitative easing, and buy these treasuries from the banks so that the banks can increase their liquidity, so that the banks don't do anything drastic like dump all these treasuries on the market. The financial system is a mess. It's a hot mess right now. And this whole thing with the repo market is showing vulnerabilities in the financial system that the Fed is very limited in their movement now at this point. They're going to be forced into, I can see them being in the very near future, forced into accommodative monetary policy. And this in turn is going to change everything from commodities are going to, gold, silver, everything is going to start to go up in price. We're going to see consumer inflation, and wow, what a mess. Listen, thank you guys for listening to this report. Like and subscribe. give me a thumbs up. And if I got something a little bit wrong in there, I didn't get it quite right, let me know in the comments section. I try to get it. I try to figure it out what's going on here as accurately as I can. But I mean, I'm only human, and I mean, these guys, they on purpose, they make all this difficult to understand. They do it on purpose because they want to bamboozle us, you know? And so we have to basically sit back and try to figure it out for ourselves what's going on. Instead of them coming right out and telling us, instead of them standing up on a podium and saying, listen, we've been bamboozling you guys with complex terms for years so that you can't understand what we're doing behind the scenes so that we can become richer and you can become poorer. Then they'd be telling the truth, I mean, but no, they're not going to tell the truth. I mean, can you imagine them standing up there and telling us the truth? Just for once in their lives? I don't think so. Anyway, listen, thank you guys for listening. Like and subscribe. And give me a thumbs up, and we'll catch you guys in the next show. Bye-bye.